Let's do it. You ready?
I am ready.
All right, Susan, here we go. So five, four, three, two, and one. All right, folks, welcome back to the podcast. I am very excited to have back Susan Pease Banitt. Susan, welcome.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be talking to you again, Guy.
Awesome, awesome. So Susan is celebrating her 49th anniversary in the field of mental health, where she's been a leader in integrating spiritual modalities with traditional practice. Susan is the award-winning author of the Trauma Toolkit, Healing PTSD from the Inside Out, and Wisdom, Attachment, and Love in Trauma Therapy Beyond Evidence-Based Practice. Her newest book, Women Therapists on Healing, will be released in the fall of 2024 from North Atlantic Books, and we're going to be talking a lot about that today. Welcome back, Susan.
Thank you so much.
So before we get going, remind our listeners where you're from originally and where you are currently.
Where I'm from originally, meaning where I was born,
Oh
or
yeah, let's do
oh,
it.
okay.
Come
All
on.
right. Yes, so I was a California girl. I was born in Palm Springs, but lived in the Bay Area my whole childhood, and the last from 9 years old till the time I left in Palo Alto, in the beginning of the dot-com era. Everything was just being born. And so there was a lot of open-mindedness and a lot of experimentation. And I really credit that for my interest in alternative and healing therapies being accepted in that environment and milieu. And then again, when I went to the Harvard teaching hospitals. So it was a great place to grow up. Then I moved to Boston for 17 years. And then I moved back to the West Coast, and I have been in the Northwest for how old are my kids? I've been here for 28 years in the Northwest.
We're in the Northwest.
I'm in Portland, Oregon.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm in Bend.
No, I didn't know that.
Yes, I've been
We'll
here
have to get together.
3.5 years.
Yeah,
All right.
awesome.
So let's dive into this new book, Woman Therapists on Healing. Um, how did this come about? Why did this come about?
Yeah, thanks for asking. Okay, so it was COVID, and at the beginning of COVID, I had become very sick. I was diagnosed with a little brain tumor. I had an unusual sinus problem that required surgery. I ended up getting COVID 3 times. I had viral meningitis. I mean, yeah, viral
Jeez.
meningitis. Like it was nuts. And I got really behind in my CEUs. So the following year, I was doing a big weekend long CEU with a major name in the trauma field, who I won't name, but who's very good in many ways. But what happened during that weekend is that this person kept mentioning people they respected as trauma experts in the field. And over, 16 hours of workshops and with 8 names being mentioned, the only female name that was mentioned was Francine Shapiro, and they kind of couldn't avoid mentioning her. And something kind of broke in me because I know so many amazing women clinicians who are published, who are experts, who are recognized as experts. And I realized that in my history of listening to these guys talk, and I mean all of them at the top, I never hear them acknowledge a woman unless they absolutely are forced to because they're talking about like a specific study or something. But in terms of who they admire and who
Hmm.
they learn from, they don't acknowledge us. And I was like, that's it. I am going to call a bunch of my friends and email and say, want to write a book with me? And they all said yes. So I have this really nice, diverse, I have several BIPOC people, which is Black, Indigenous people of color, several LGBTQ plus people, and from all areas of the country, and at least one from another country. So it's been a delightful thing. It was quite a long process getting it done, and was my first time doing an anthology. But one of the things I asked was, because women learn and process their trauma in sharing rather than question answer,
Hmm.
I asked my authors to reveal a little bit of their journey, themselves and their journey. And some authors wrote an entire chapter that was autobiographical, and some, like myself, put poignant parts of their journey on the page to illustrate the things they were trying to teach.
So let
So,
me,
yeah.
if I may, was that a prerequisite for being a part of this anthology?
Yeah, I mean, sort of. I mean, I requested it. I wasn't going to, I don't like being super forceful, like you have
Hmm.
to, but I explained why, I explained what the project was looking like. And the project was originally entitled Wild Geese because of the, and I write about that in the introduction, because of the cooperative nature of goose leadership, is that the one the person in the front tires, somebody else takes their place, and it's functions on a
Hmm.
basis of empathy. So I thought that for women reading, if they could connect to these women's stories as sort of part of the flock, it
Hmm.
would be really helpful because we all have our own stories. All of us do.
Yeah. And I love that idea. And it's how we connect with people. There's a lot of uh, uh, there's a strong sense in this field to oftentimes not share our own story because it may get in the way and boundaries and this and that. But when we hear people talking about themselves and sharing their stories, it creates this connection that we need for healing. And to hear you talk about the genesis of this book, to me, I'm not surprised, but it's so crazy. You know, so many of the people at therapists are women. The majority of them are women.
That's what I write about in the introduction, is like the majority of the consumers are women, the majority of the therapists are women. But why do we always have the same 4 or 5 guys at the top telling us about what we should be doing in our experience
Right.
without acknowledging their women therapists they have inevitably seen over the years? They're people that they've gleaned information from, and I talk about the patriarchal structure, and in my chapter, and Christine Forner, who I'm sure you've interviewed for My SSTD, her whole chapter is called How Feminism Saved My Life. And she talks about this in the field too, of like, it's interesting how it's still kind of almost blind to the field of trauma. The fact that voices are suppressed.
The fact that when you look at the trauma summits out there and even the mental health summits out there, you do see those 4 or 5 men that we all see, that we all know, many of whom are very well respected and for good reasons. But that kind of feels like a holdover. It does to me feel like there is a movement, a current that is replacing that in a sense with what you're talking about here. Um, Aside from bringing women together, you mentioned anthology, and that is what basically a collection of.
Yes, this is
Okay,
every chapter is written by a different trauma expert in their field.
okay.
And
So it
yeah,
was this book is the overarching theme is trauma.
yes. It's
Okay,
divided into 3 sections. Trauma and dissociation is the first section. Intersectionality is the second section, and medical, I forget how we worded it, um, life-threatening medical illness is the third section, because medical traumas often are not acknowledged or talked about. And yet everybody I've seen with a trauma history has had profoundly traumatic interactions with the medical establishment.
so walk us through, Susan, uh, if you can get more specific about the different elements of these chapters or sections of the book. Give us a little juice there, if you would.
Okay. Can you be a little more specific? I'm
Well,
not really.
yeah, you said the first part was
Trauma
the
and
second
dissociation.
trauma and dissociation. What did you choose one author for that?
Actually, the structure came after the topics came in because I asked people to submit the topics they wanted to write on.
Okay.
And then as I started reading the chapters, I realized they fell into these like three basic camps. And so I really wanted to highlight those so that people in the bookstore who are browsing through could be like, oh, wow, there's a whole section on intersectionality and feminism. That really lights me up and I want to read that, you know.
Okay. So the first part was the dissociation. Talk a little bit about that. Why? How is that important to you? How did that become important to you?
That is an emerging, that is a really emerging hot topic in the field. And you probably, I'm sure you've interviewed Jamie Marich a few times at this point. Jamie's one of my authors actually in that section. And she and I have corresponded a lot. And I was part of her book, Dissociation Made Simple. And I've been a member of the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation for a number of years because I felt like when I was supervising people and training people, dissociation was never really on the curriculum for
Hmm.
therapists. It was a big, ironically enough, blank spot, which is what dissociation is. Like we were dissociating away from dissociation, right, as a
Hmm.
profession. And I wanted to interrupt that and I wanted to call people's attention. So I've been talking about dissociation for a really long time. So it was Nat, and my chapter is called Did That Really Happen to Me? And it's a workshop I've given about memory and what constitutes a memory. What is a recovered memory? Because people have a lot of ideas about that in the general public that actually aren't really true.
For
So,
example,
for example, it's like you're sitting there one day in therapy, and all of a sudden, like this whole memory flashes into your head, and it's like a Hollywood movie almost, like really
hmm
dramatic. And that happens occasionally, but more often, what I talk about is that the memory, instead of being stored whole in the brain, gets broken up into pieces and stored. So, and there's three, and I do this in my workshops of like ask people to think about a memory that you've had, and now think about the components of that memory. And they always break down into three categories, which is the sensory input, sight, hearing, taste, touch, smell, right? There's the interoception, the emotional feeling of what's happening. So surprise, joy, shock, horror, whatever's going on inside. And then the third part is the narrative, the story of what happened. And what happens is the brain does this divide and conquer. If you're under 8 years old, the brain splits those memories up into the components up into different places. When they come together and reassociate is when you have the whole, you realize this thing really happened. But what's really, really common and not really talked about as much as I'd like it to be is that most of clients with horrendous histories, they have what I call memory fragments, and they've had them their whole life. And
hmm
those memory fragments can be like a visual snapshot. Sometimes it's just like a picture they have in their mind that they don't, they think of it as a daydream or a fantasy rather than as an actual memory. Or they have a persistent somatic state that they can't shake, like feel like deep, deep feelings of abandonment, that they don't know where it comes from and they don't know how to get rid of it. That is a memory fragment for a lot of people. Or in my case, and what I wrote about in my book was I had a narrative fragment was I think this person molested me. And that was a thought I'd been having for over, at that point, let's see, I was 42. So yeah, I'd been having that thought for about 20 years
hmm
at that point, but no therapist had ever been able to like help me with that. And also trauma was such a new field
hmm
that there wasn't kind of the skill level back then that there is now. So in my case, my narrative fragment, when I said it, and my therapist said, say that again, and I said it again, and then it was a total body knowing that that had happened. It was
Wow.
undeniable. It was like what I say is my mind surrendered its disbelief. Like in a second, it was clear that something had happened. It took a long time for the full memory to emerge,
hmm
but the veracity of that was apparent at that point, and then I could start working with it.
Intersectionality. Talk a little bit about that chapter. What did you want to bring forth?
Well, there's a lot of kinds of traumas that people have that aren't really talked about that well in the DSM or other places. And the trauma of racism and sexism are among those. And so I have in that section my wonderful friend Jovelyn Hardy, who I've known for years. We met on the NASW board. She's African American, and she joins up intergenerational African American trauma with Bowenian family therapy theory in her chapter,
Wow.
and how that really helped her see things and what she's trying to bring to her community. And I was like, wow, that's amazing. Like I've never seen those things put in the same place, you know? And another friend of mine, Leanne Johnson, I met her through Comedy Sports. She's an improvisational actress and storyteller, but she also runs the diversity part of the Oregon Healthcare Plan. And she consider her a systems therapist, and she has her degree in organizational psychology. And she talks about the trauma of her life and the racism, and then how that's affected her job and how that racism has continued to follow her into her job. And over time, those things are very traumatizing. And I think they're more traumatizing than we actually have given them credit for. So yeah, in her chapter, she talks about the first time she heard the N word, she was 10 years old, and it sent her into a full body panic and reaction. Like, that's intense. And it's not something that I hear talked about in trauma conferences. It's not something I see on assessments, right?
Mhm.
So these voices haven't been brought to the fore. And then I have another friend, Claudia Velikova from Chicago area, who I met her at an Evolution of Psychotherapy conference years ago. And subsequent to that, she had a real breakthrough of consciousness about herself, her sexual identity, and her indigenous identity. She had a grandmother who was a curandera from Mexico, and she fully has embraced the indigenous aspects of her lineage and herself. And her title is called Land Back, and it's written in a very storytelling circular style, which is a more indigenous way of talking. And it's beautiful. And she and I have talked about several times the trauma of losing your land, which is not something that a lot of Americans dial into
Mhm.
for various reasons. So that's very profound to me that we don't really ever talk about those things in trauma therapy, you know.
It's interesting, Susan, hearing you talk, and putting together the pieces of the book you're sharing so far. I'm getting this sense of uh, there seems to be like a healthy frustration of why are we not listening? Why are we not hearing? Why are we not putting the pieces of the puzzle together that we've had? But we're not listening. We're not hearing them. There's this sense of what are we doing? How come we're not taking advantage of this? And
Right.
that's the sense I'm getting, the energy that's coming forth.
Well, and I think the why, I think that's an easy question to answer. It's because if everybody at the top is a white academic man, what do they know about this?
Right,
It's not their lived experience,
right,
you know?
right, right. All right. So, and then finally, the last part of the book, the last chapter, if you will, talk to us a little bit about that.
I'm sorry, say that again.
The last part of the book,
The
you had
last, oh,
dissociation and
yes.
intersectionality and
Yes. So my colleague and friend Jade Barclay is in Australia, and she is mixed Maori and European. She's dealt with a lot of chronic invisible illness, they call it, things like Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, POTS, and things that the Western medical establishment is not only not very good at helping with, but also very disbelieving of, especially in years past. I think we're slowly creeping up to awareness about those things. And she's an academic who's done like really amazing work in this area and has networked with a lot of people in her country around this and is bringing a lot of awareness to those things. So she writes about that. And Lisa Danilchuk, past president of ISSTD, just gave birth, as you know, probably a little while ago. And she writes about kind of a wonderful experience in the hospital and how necessary a caring, holding environment emotionally is to a good physical outcome, which I also think, I was a medical social worker, so I know that that's true. And in the Harvard teaching hospitals at that time, when I was working there in the early 90s, they were actually fairly aware of that. And they were aware that the social worker could bring that mojo, if you will, to their units and to their clinics, and they had a lot of social workers. And then my colleague, Eileen Aveni, who also was very involved with ISSTD, and she was past chairperson of the Ritual Abuse and Mind Control Special Interest Group, which I've been heavily a part of in my career. And she started off in oncology like I did. And eventually she started having these patients show up in her practice in Michigan, a bunch of them with these backgrounds of what she called occult abuse or ritual abuse, and started diving into that. And it's become a specialty of hers. And she's one of my go-to people when I get stumped. So she writes a very interesting narrative where she brings you along from her beginnings as a therapist, like how she discovered this world, what she did about it, how she learned to work with it, and what it is, which to my knowledge, I have never seen, aside from Alison Miller's book, which is a little different. Her books are more like textbooks. This is kind of a more personal narrative account of how she as a clinician walked into this world, how it affected her and how she handled it.
So kind of in summary, what is your hope for the therapists out there who are listening to this, who are really intrigued by this? What is your hope that they will get from this book, that they will take away?
Well, I hope that they feel seen, for one thing, because I feel like there's been this stigma of therapists who say, I have trauma, I have dissociation, or I'm DID, or I'm OSD. Like, it's still considered quite taboo in some circles to have therapists be out like that. But like I say in the book, there is no them. There's only us.
Right.
And we shouldn't be, as therapists, excluded from the circle of healing and compassion because we're holding a certain boundary for other people. And I want therapists to feel like not only educated by the things in this book, but also nurtured by it.
Awesome. Awesome. All right, Susan, once again, the book is called Women Therapists on Healing, to be released in the fall of 2024.
Yeah.
Is that still correct?
Yeah, I think we're looking at November release right now.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, so exciting talking to you. So inspiring. So you've got so much energy. I mean, you can feel it. I love it. Pleasure talking to you, as always.
Yeah, pleasure talking to you too. I'll come back anytime. And
anytime.
Yeah, I'll be sending some of my authors your way as well. So.
Okay. Take care.
All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.